A recent entry got me thinking about my own let's not meet. When I was 13, my mom, my young brother, and I were living with my mom's parents. We had escaped my mom's seriously abusive, psychopathic husband, and while living with my grandparents wasn't ideal, we needed a safe place for my mom to physically recover. My grandmother had trailers and sheds on the property that she would rent out to people who needed a cheap place to live but had no other options, such as undocumented workers or people with criminal records. Most of them were really nice and just kept to themselves. And then there was Steve. Steve started asking my mom out. She was straight with him and told him no. She was still dealing with her husband's threats and had no interest in dating for the next several years. But he kept asking, then begging, then arguing. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He started following her around. We'd be at the bus stop and Steve would be watching us from across the street. We'd be getting dinner and he'd sit outside the diner, watching us through the window. I'd even seen him following me to and from school. We stopped letting my brother walk to his school alone because Steve would follow him too. He was always around. Then he started whispering outside our bedroom window at night. Every night for hours, the three of us would sit huddled in the dark listening to Steve ranting and raving, begging, shouting, threatening. He would call my mom his angel, his soulmate, a whore, a tease, a demon, all while trying to peer through the blinds. He was escalating. But why didn't you call the police, you're asking yourself? Simple. Grandma made it very clear that Steve was a paying tenant and much more valuable than her own stupid, useless daughter. If Mom cost her money, she'd throw us back on the street, which would cost her custody of my brother, and my brother would not survive his father on his own. So we were trapped. One night during his ranting, Steve had an epiphany. Of course my mom loved him too. Of course. She'd wanted to be with him. The only thing keeping them apart were her children. They could be together once my brother and I disappeared. I can still remember how calm and sympathetic he sounded when he assured her that he'd take care of everything, and they could be together soon. She didn't have to worry about us anymore. He'd handle getting rid of us. The next morning, Mom contacted my stepdad to ask him how to defend us physically. My stepdad, knowing my mom literally couldn't defend herself against an irritated cat, convinced my mom to tell him the problem. He told her to go home and not to worry about it. He'd talk to Steve. I don't know what my stepdad said to Steve. I don't know what he did, but Steve was gone before I got home from school that day. He had only taken what he could carry and disappeared. So Steve, you made an already bad situation terrifying. My brother and I aren't children anymore, so for your sake, let's not meet. A current harmless admirer just messaged me after a few months, and it got me thinking about my first, and hopefully last, legit stalker. This was years ago. I was probably grade 10 or 11 or so, as I had just gotten my license and was learning to drive. I fancied myself an amateur photographer, so I was off by a creek one day taking pictures of ducks or whatever. A guy wanders up to me and starts asking me questions about my camera. He looked to be only a few years older than me, but I could tell he was younger, brain-wise. And I was more than happy to tell him about my fancy new DSLR. The creek was by a bridge near my house, and as me and dude were talking, my mom drives by and spots me. She tells me she's going to the corner store for snacks and asks if I want to get some driving practice in. I say yes, and while I'm hopping into the front seat, dude gets into the back. What? My mom thinks he's a buddy since he doesn't look much older, so she says nothing and casually chats with him as we drive. When we get to the store, he goes off a few aisles to get chips, and I tell my mom I have no fucking idea who this guy is. We aren't sure if he's violent or not, so my mom takes over driving. He hops into the car and she tells him that she will drive him back to his house. Nah, I'll go wherever you guys go. What, ×2? She makes up some lie about going to a family gathering out of town and drops him off where she found him. Our house was nearby, so she takes off in the opposite direction, and we drive around for half an hour so he doesn't know where we live. When we come back, he's nowhere to be found, so we go home. Fast forward a few days later, we were on our porch doing porch things, and I spot a guy standing at the end of the street. It's too far to see if it's dude, but I mention it to my mom and we go inside. A week later, the same deal. We don't call the cops because we can't tell if it's dude, but we have a feeling. He's just standing there at the intersection. Just standing. Fast forward a week or two more, and I'm at work. I get a call from my mother. Apparently dude rang the bell and asked my grandmother if I was home. My grandmother, slightly ailed with early onset dementia, totally forgot about the creeper and says no, I'm at work, accidentally confirming I live there. He asks where I work, and thanks to that early onset dementia, she forgot the name, but tells him it's a restaurant in the mall. Well, fuck. So I'm freaked out and telling my coworkers the story. One line cook grabs a newspaper and shows me the most wanted list. There dude is, for violation of probation. Line cook says her husband went to jail with him for a bit, and that he's supposedly non-violent and was in for fraud or some shit, but to be careful and get an escort to my car after the shift. We show the picture around to staff and they decide it's best for me to work in the kitchen that day, as my normal grill station is literally 2 feet from the door. Not even an hour goes by and dude comes in asking for me. Now keep in mind, my grandmother didn't even know where I worked, so he must have went around to every restaurant in the mall. Mine was tucked in a corner of a department store that normally only old people shop at, so I'm amazed he even knew it was there. Most people told me, "That place doesn't have a restaurant, you must be mistaken," whenever I told them where I worked, so it was pretty hidden to those 65 and younger. My coworker tells him there's no one by my name, and he gets kind of irate and insists that I work there. I must have been the last one he checked. My manager hears the kerfuffle and comes out threatening security and whatnot. He leaves and I immediately call the Crime Stopper's number. He stopped by my house once more that day before I was off shift, and then I never saw or heard from him again. I still don't know if he gave up or if they caught him. I had only told Crime Stoppers that he had told me he lived in the area with his grandmother, so maybe that was enough info. Edit, forgot to mention that although he didn't look much older, dude was in his 30s. So this happened last summer over the course of 3 days. I had just moved to a new city after getting promoted at my job, and I had to move quick, like 3 weeks after I got promoted. I didn't know anyone in the city except for one old college friend who had his own place with an open guest room. It was in a very sketchy part of town, but I thought it'd be a perfect spot to crash for a couple months until I got established. That section of town was basically mostly abandoned warehouses with a few very old and run-down houses scattered in between that were never bought out. One of which was his. His girlfriend lived about an hour away and he worked remotely, so he'd sometimes spend days away at a time. And even though I'm a grown dude that looks threatening, being alone at that house in a new city used to freak me out after dark. It was a place where you'd always be wondering if you just heard a firework or a gunshot. The nearest houses, the ones that weren't abandoned, were usually all quiet by like 10 p.m., and there was no reason to be in this part of town at night unless you lived there. So hearing any night sounds were always a cause for concern, because of break-ins, drug addicts, etc. About 3 weeks into living there, Mark was gone at his girlfriend's, and I was smashed from working and fell asleep early. I woke up at 1 a.m. to sounds right outside my window, which sounded like someone was messing with our huge city-issued trash cans. Not wanting to get involved and not minding if someone was trying to jack our recyclables, I eventually fell back to sleep, even though it felt like they were messing around out there for like an hour. The next morning as I was leaving for work, I was surprised to see that all the trash was put back in the cans. The only weird thing is that our personal letters with mine and Mark's names on them, our bills, spam mail that was addressed to us, etc., were all removed and neatly stacked on the ground next to the cans. The weird part is that they had been sorted into 2 piles, one for mine, I had switched this house to my mailing address, and a larger pile for Mark's mail. I just assumed it was a weird obsessive act of a meth addict or something, and threw them back in the trash. The next night I totally forgot about it, didn't think it was a concern. I got up to use the restroom at like 3 in the morning and heard someone outside again, messing with our trash cans, like ripping apart a new bag I'd put in there, which was just like cut veggies and other food waste. I must have woke up angry and courageous because I grabbed a baseball bat and turned on our lights on the side of the house. I threw some shoes on, but by the time I got out there, I saw some guy kind of speed walking away like 100 feet away from me. Weird thing is that he looked just like an average guy, not a drifter/addict type that would be more common around our place that late. He looked like he was literally wearing khakis and a dark t-shirt. I was exhausted, pissed, and confused, but I went back to sleep, figured it may not have been the same guy as the night before. So this last night I was thinking about it when I fall asleep. I did wake up eventually. I was half asleep that whole night, I think listening for noises, and I forget what time it was. But I heard what I thought was initially like a high-pitched scraping sound, not against my window, but the wall of the house, like someone running a thin piece of metal against a surface. Then I realized that I was just barely awake and nobody was actually scraping our house at all, but it was like a high-pitched crying noise, but it was soft and screeching with the cries lasting in long bursts, which made my tired brain think that that was a scratching noise. Like someone was really crying hard, but doing everything they could to contain the noise, but they were so upset they couldn't hold it all in. I sort of froze and lied there listening, and whoever the person was just like 5 feet away from me, separated just by my wall, wondering what I should do. I wanted to make sure it was a person and not an animal or something, but lying there listening, I definitely heard some sighs and sniffles that were obviously human, and in hindsight, I think it was a very distraught man. I pictured him in his 40s, but I have no way of knowing his age. I thought about calling the cops, but didn't know what I'd say, so I just laid there for about 15 minutes until I heard him shuffling away, then looked outside the bathroom window on that side of the house to see the trash can lid was open, but the contents weren't really messed with. I lived there another 2 months and never experienced anything like this after that. I told Mark about all this when he was home. He said that he had no idea who it could have been, or if it was different people, or why they would have gone through our mail like that. It was definitely creepy, but I never really felt in danger or anything during those 3 days. It was just a weird occurrence. Something of the like I've never experienced before then or since. Anyway, let's not meet to whomever that person was. And I'm not sure I want to know what the hell you were doing those 3 nights.